Costa Family Justice Center. This is going to be a recorded session, so if you're not comfortable being on camera, don't feel like you have to be. I work for the Contra Costa Family Justice Center. I'm the center director for our Concord office, and this is our Family Justice Institute. And so our Family Justice Institute, we put on about anywhere from 20 to 25 workshops a year, totally free for service providers, for clients, anybody who's interested. And we really try and get experts in their fields to come and talk about topics that you all are interested in. So sometimes that's mandated reporting. We've had workshops on strangulation, child abuse, just various different topics. So it's wonderful to have you here. Today we're doing a basics course. It's called Interpersonal Violence 101. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you all. Give me 1 second to get started. Okay. All right. So I just introduced myself, as you know, so let me go ahead and move forward. So it'd be great to hear where you all are from. I'm going to do a poll. And if you could, go ahead and just share what sector you're working in. You know, is it county, healthcare, government? Let us know where you're from. So far, nonprofits winning. I know you can't see the responses yet, but so far we have most in nonprofit, couple county. Give people 1 more minute to respond. All right, we'll go ahead and see the results. All right, so it looks like the nonprofit sector has the most folks being here, with county next. A couple folks from healthcare and government and the private sector. Wonderful. Thank you all. Okay, let's keep going. So today's Interpersonal Violence 101 is going to talk about the definitions for anything related to interpersonal violence. So that includes domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, elder abuse, human trafficking, and stalking. I'm going to touch on these topics. You could do an 1.5 hour training on each of these individual topics and go really in depth. This is just a broad overview to get a basic understanding. We're also going to be talking about safety risks and potential protective factors that survivors have. And it's important to really understand the needs of the survivors and what they're needing in terms of safety planning, anything related to that. And you're also going to learn how to refer a client to the Family Justice Center. So if in your work, in your personal life, you interact with somebody who's experiencing one of these interpersonal violence issues, you know how to get them support and how to get them some help. If we do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'll try and answer at the end of the session, if that's okay, just to give everybody a chance to put in their thoughts and anything they might be interested in understanding. So in order to start talking about interpersonal violence, we really need to start by talking about trauma and getting a basic understanding of what trauma is. So I use this quote from The Body Keeps the Score, and it's a little bit long, but I want to read it to you. Trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It has also left an imprint. It is also the imprint left by that experience on the mind, the brain, and the body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present. Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way mind and brain manage perceptions. And it changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. And I really appreciate this quote, because a lot of times what happens is we have survivors that walk into our office that maybe have just experienced a traumatic event the weekend before, the night before, and they're needing support. But they're also in this state of survival mode because they've just had something that's traumatic that's happened to them. And so sometimes I tell people, think about like a fender bender that you've been in, nothing too severe. I don't want to go that deep, but something that kind of rattled you and startled you. And then immediately after that, very rarely do you remember, like if somebody came and talked to you, what they said, don't really know what steps you took right after that. And the reason for that is because it's actual biological response. That when we're in a situation where we're scared for our safety, our body shuts down into flight or fight mode. And so the amygdala, which is right in the middle, as you can see in our brain, that turns on. And that's that reptilian brain of, do I need to freeze? Do I need to run away? What do I need to do to make sure I am safe? And when the amygdala takes over, what that means is the front part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex that controls logic, rational thought, that takes a back seat. And so there's actually a physiological reason as to why when you're in a traumatic experience, you don't always remember everything in like a linear process, or if somebody comes up to you right after and asks questions, you don't remember what you said to them. You may not remember what even they asked you. And it's because your body is reacting to the trauma that you've experienced. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, but I wanted to give this basic overview just to get an understanding of where survivors are coming from when they experience interpersonal violence incidents. So as I mentioned, interpersonal violence includes all of these areas. I'm going to touch on them just broadly and get basic definitions. We do have other trainings with the Institute that go a little bit deeper into some of these. So please feel free to continue to check on our website to get updates on other workshops that are going to go a little more in depth. Okay, I'm going to start by talking about domestic violence. So the definition of domestic violence is abuse in intimate relationships. It's a pattern of coercive behavior designed to exert power and control over somebody else. Now, when I say interpersonal violence, or excuse me, domestic violence in an intimate relationship, what do you usually think of? What's the first type of relationship that comes to your mind? And you can either unmute or put it in the chat. What type of relationship? Husband, wife, great. Yep, romantic relationships, yep, great. So it includes those. It includes spouses, partners, but it's actually a little bit broader. It includes familial relationships too. So as a spouse, current, former dating partner, yes, somebody with CASA mentioned, but it also includes family. And so when it says here cohabitant or former cohabitant, that is not a roommate. What that is it's somebody that maybe you used to date or you have more of a close relationship with. So it's somebody that maybe you shared a bank account with. It's somebody that used to be on your health insurance. There's an additional step in your relationship that you took versus, you pay rent, you each share, a room in the house, you each pay rent to the same person. That's a little bit too far out of the circle that we're encompassing. It can be a co-parent. It can be the child of either person and a relative within the first or second degree. So what that means is you're thinking about grandparents, you're thinking about grandchildren, you can think about cousins, you can think about aunts and uncles. All these encompass intimate relationships. Oh, sorry. I'm sure you've seen the power and control wheel before. And the reason why we always like to start by talking about the power and control wheel is because there's multiple forms of domestic violence that take place within a relationship. A lot of times I think the media or TV shows really focus on the physical violence that could take place in a relationship, but there's several other types. And all of it's really geared towards exerting power and control over an individual. And so there could be, yes, physical violence, sexual violence, but there also could be emotional violence. Financial abuse is very common, spiritual abuse. A lot of what we see in our office is clients that are co-parenting with another individual. They don't live together, but sometimes that co-parent will use the children to put messages back to mom or dad. So there's lots of different ways that people, those that are causing harm, use power and control to exert over another individual. And when thinking about abusive relationships, we really want to look at a cycle. There's a cycle that happens within the relationship that people stay within. So there's usually a honeymoon phase, I would say. So what usually tends to happen is, I'm going to use a dating relationship as an example. You start dating, things seem to be going okay, you're getting to know one another, and then there's a tension building phase. Things set the other person off, you're not sure what's going on, but little blips happen. And the tension building builds unto the point of an explosion. So whether it's a physical altercation that happens, whether it's very violent threats that are made towards the other person, this explosion just takes place. And immediately after that explosion is a honeymoon phase again. The person that caused harm is very sorry for what they did. They say they're going to try and get help. They want to try and get support, maybe go to couples counseling, whatever that looks like. And that usually lasts for a little bit until you get into a tension building phase again. And as you can see, this cycle continues and continues and continues in relationships until one of the people in the relationship breaks that cycle. So this can look like either the survivor who's experiencing the abuse saying, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be in this relationship anymore. Maybe they try and leave. This can also look like the person that's causing harm actually getting help. So they're actually going to a therapist. They're actually making conscious efforts to try and change their behavior. That doesn't happen very often because whenever we're in relationships, you get comfortable, right? You get familiar with that person, you get familiar with that relationship. And so it really takes a lot to break out of this cycle. In a very severe domestic violence cases, there's never a honeymoon phase. The honeymoon phase starts to go away. And you're either in a tension building phase or you're in an explosion phase. And then it goes right back into tension building and right back into explosion. And as I said, the only way that you break this cycle is you have somebody in the relationship make an actual change to break that cycle. Just a little bit on statistics. How often does domestic violence happen between partners? It's estimated that about 1 in 4 women have experienced domestic violence within a relationship, and about 1 in 7 men. On average, I'm going to use female as an example. Men also do experience domestic violence. Non-binary gender individuals also experience domestic violence, but at least for our Family Justice Center, we see the most survivors coming in identify as female. So a woman will attempt to leave an abusive relationship 7 times before they actually finally leave that relationship. And so as you see, it's very difficult to try and break that cycle that they're going through. It takes a lot of attempts. So some people ask, well, why don't they just leave? If somebody's hurting you, right, the most sense makes is for you to leave that relationship, because then you won't be hurt anymore. But there's several other factors that come into play with that. A lot of times there's a lack of other options for the individual, especially when we saw with the pandemic, when people were losing their jobs left and right, they weren't getting an income, maybe they were undocumented and so they weren't getting the stimulus checks that were coming to folks. There's not a lot of options. And as we know, especially in the Bay Area, financial dependence is key. It is expensive to live here. And so to go from a 2-income household to leaving, maybe with your children, into a 1-income household and trying to find a place that you can rent, that you can afford, is really hard. And so what we saw most often throughout the pandemic has been people were staying in their abusive relationships because they financially couldn't afford to leave, which is a horrible situation to be in. The other thing that I try and remind people too is that you usually love the people that are hurting you. You know, you have a relationship with these individuals. You want the best for them. You want them to get help if they're exerting behavior that's not okay. And the last thing you want to do is sort of let that relationship go, especially if it's been a relationship you've been in for a very long time with this person. So there's a number of reasons why folks decide to stay in those relationships. just to get an idea of how frequently domestic violence happens within Contra Costa County. I'm going to put a caveat on all of the statistics that I show, in that all types of interpersonal violence go unreported. The majority of them are unreported. And so that being said, this gives us a little window into the most severe cases where somebody has reached out for help. And so at least in 2020, there were about 3,100 domestic violence police reports made within the 26 law enforcement agencies in Contra Costa County. So what that means is you've gotten to a point in the relationship, the abuse is bad enough that you're now having to call the police, right? So about 3,100 of those happened in 2020. However, there's a whole set of abusive relationships that are happening that haven't gotten to the point where you have to call the police, right? Because there's emotional abuse, there's financial abuse. It's harder to report those things. Those things are not as familiar to us. So this just gives a little snapshot into some of the cases that Contra Costa sees. I also want to take a moment. I think it's very important to discuss gun violence in terms of domestic violence relationships, especially with all the shootings that have happened recently. Over 50% of mass shooting cases, that individual had a background of domestic or family violence. And more than a third of those individuals should not have been allowed a firearm, for, whether it was a restraining order or whether they were on probation or parole. There was actually a court order saying they should not have a firearm, and they still were able to get one. Okay. I want to do a scenario. I want to be as interactive as possible. So I'm going to give you a scenario to see if this sounds like interpersonal violence or not to you. So I'm going to start by saying, last week, John caught his wife, Kelly, cheating on him with another man. The couple have had financial trouble the last few years, and John and Kelly have been growing distant. John feels betrayed by Kelly and wants a divorce. So I'm going to do another poll here and get a sense from you all. Is this interpersonal violence? Is this not interpersonal violence? Do we need more information to be able to decide if it is? So far, I'm getting a whole lot of no's. What do folks think? Some people are not sure. That's totally okay. These are questions that are purposefully challenging for folks. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Let's share the results. So the majority of you said, no, this is not interpersonal violence. That doesn't meet the definition, at least what we've seen so far. But a few of you have also said, you know what, I'm not sure. And that's totally okay. So in discussing this scenario, I would, as somebody working with domestic violence survivors, without any other information, I would say this is not domestic violence. This is not interpersonal violence. There's not enough here that we know of. Now, if the financial troubles were caused because John forced Kelly to deposit her pay stub into his account, that's domestic violence because it's financial abuse, right? If after John catches Kelly cheating on him, he threatens her safety somehow, or he does something to physically harm her, it becomes domestic violence. And some people will say, well, isn't cheating on another person, that's a type of emotional abuse, right? It absolutely is. But when we're looking within the context of interpersonal violence, we're looking at a person's safety. So yes, emotional abuse, it is very emotionally damaging to cheat on your partner, but is it threatening their safety somehow? Are you doing something to make them feel safe, make them feel scared that something else is going to happen to them? And that's the takeaway that I want you to have with this one. Okay, we're going to jump right into the next topic, and this is child abuse. And so it's a very, very standard definition. It's in a person that inflicts the following on somebody under the age of 18. So if any of these things happen and the person is under 18, that's automatically child abuse. So it could be a physical injury, it could be sexual abuse, It could be willful harming. Corporal punishment somehow is also child abuse. And the key distinction here in child abuse from domestic violence within adults is neglect. If you are responsible for taking care of a child and you neglect that responsibility, you don't feed them, you don't put a roof over their head, you don't clothe them, you don't clean them, that's also child abuse. I'm not going to read through all of these. This is examples. And again, the key thing is, if thinking about that power and control wheel a little bit ago, we're talking about, you know, emotional abuse, physical abuse, those are included in here, right? But it's the addition of the neglect that also comes into play, and or abandonment. If you leave your kid, that can be considered child abuse in certain situations. I think it's really important to also note children who witness domestic violence can suffer severe emotional and developmental difficulties similar to children who have been the direct victims of the abuse. So a lot of times what happens, our clients will come in and they'll say, well, my kids were home when my husband and I had a fight, but it's okay, they didn't see anything. They were in their room. So they're fine. They're okay, they don't know what's going on. And that is absolutely not true. The effects that children have just witnessing domestic violence, hearing the domestic violence, that can have the same impact as children who were actually being physically harmed by somebody. To get an idea of the stats within Contra Costa County, between October 2019 and September 2020, there were about 7,500 child maltreatment allegations made to Children and Family Services. Every time a maltreatment allegation is made, you call CFS hotline. They then have to do an investigation to see if it's substantiated, and about 1,100 of those reports were substantiated. I also want to make note that children who witness domestic violence also may grow up to either perpetrate or be the survivor of domestic violence in their own romantic relationships. And that's where the generational cycle comes in. Because if, again, looking back at the cycle, if you don't have anybody who breaks that cycle of the honeymoon tension building explosion, and you grow up with that as a model, you don't know anything else, right? You don't know what it's like to live in a home that doesn't have fighting, that doesn't have physical violence in it. And so what's going to happen when you have your own relationship? You're going to do those same things because that's what you grew up with. You don't know any other way. Okay. Continuing to move on here. I know we're going right through these pretty quickly. Again, broad overview. I want to discuss human trafficking next. So human trafficking occurs when someone deprives or violates the personal liberty of another with the intent to obtain forced labor or services. So when we think about human trafficking, I know a lot of times people think of sex trafficking, right? You think of maybe traffickers that force individuals to go out and perform sex acts, bring back money. But we also include labor trafficking within this scenario. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. The important thing I also want to mention is it does not always have to involve somebody crossing a border or even being physically forced to stay with somebody. Being physically forced to, you can't leave your trafficker. It's not the requirement of human trafficking. So to get more into the definitions, the types of labor trafficking that we see tend to be within the agricultural industry, domestic work, hostess strip clubs, factories, hospitality industry. This is where people are taken advantage of in a more employment setting. You're asking them to do something for you, and they're not getting adequate compensation for the work that they are doing or performing. Now, sex trafficking is different, obviously, and the more cases we see coming out of that is through massage businesses. There can be residential brothels, sometimes within hotels within the city, escort services, These tend to happen at truck stops. So there's various different areas within industries that you tend to see sex trafficking occur. Okay, I want to make a very big caveat and say human trafficking data is very hard to collect. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is because it is underreported. If we think domestic violence is underreported, human trafficking is like non-existent. And if you are the survivor of human trafficking, if you're being victimized, sometimes you don't always know that that's what's happening. So I'm gonna explain that a little bit more, because what tends to happen is we'll have a client that comes into the center and they'll say, my boyfriend has been really abusive towards me lately. He doesn't let me keep my ID. He takes it back as soon as I get home. He forces me to go do things for other people. He threatens me if I don't do those things. And the story then starts to sound like, I think this is human trafficking. I don't think this is a domestic violence relationship anymore. I have never had a client come in and say, I am being trafficked, ever. They don't identify it. And so that's why we see the data of, in 2018, Contra Costa Partners identified 384 human trafficking survivors. I think that's an extremely low number. We have significantly more cases that we work within the county. It's just they're either not identified or they're not being reported. I want to talk a little bit about something called CSEC, commercially sexually exploited children. And this is a very specific type of human trafficking where it occurs with a child under the age of 18. They're sexually trafficked or received food or shelter in exchange for, or is paid to perform sexual acts, and whose parent or guardian failed to or was unable to protect their child. Populations that we tend to see most often become part of CSEC youth are those that have family violence in their history. They do not come from a stable household. There is violence within their home. A lot of times truancy is a big indicator of somebody who has the potential to be victimized for human trafficking. They usually have some type of juvenile system involvement, and CFS at some point has gotten involved with the family. Maybe they've been pulled out of the home because of the violence that's gone on or the abuse, and now they're living in a foster home. Most of the CSEC cases that we see within Contra Costa County are foster youth. They are living in foster group homes and are constantly running away from those to earn money, and because it's a survival tactic. I'm not going to read all of this again, but in understanding CSEC cases, there needs to be a minimum of one or two of the following. So they need to be able, you start to notice that they're being controlled or what they call groomed by another person. They also spend time with people that are known to be involved in commercial sex. So it's traffickers or it's groomers that are working to get more individuals into this line of this type of issue. They use the internet frequently or social media and involve sexual behavior of some kind. Like I said, there's a history of running away from the home. There's unstable housing there, homelessness, couch surfing, also prior involvement with law enforcement, and they're usually pretty truant. There's also usually a history of substance abuse that occurs. Okay, we're going to go on to the next topic, which is discussing rape and sexual assault. So the definition for rape is a little more narrow than the definition for sexual assault, and I'm going to explain the difference in a minute. So rape is sexual intercourse without consent. So there is also no consent that can be granted if the person lacks the capacity to give consent. Maybe they have a developmental delay and aren't able to consent to something. They cannot resist to intoxication of some kind. They're not conscious. They're not aware of an act taking place. They consent because they are threatened, they're scared for their safety, or at least in the state of California, if you are under the age of 18, you cannot consent to sex. It's a blanket rule. In other states, they have different age limits. So I know some states have like 16 as the age of consent, but at least in the state of California, it is 18 years old. How often does rape happen? Again, it's an underreported crime, but the Rape and Incest National Network predicts that about 1 out of every 6 American women has been the victim of an attempted rape or a completed rape in her lifetime, and about 1 in 33 men. Now, I mentioned that rape is a very narrow definition. Sexual assault is a little bit broader because it's not just sexual intercourse. It can include non-consensual sexual intercourse, but it also includes sodomy, oral copulation, sexual penetration, sexual touching of somebody, and it's by force, by violence, by duress, by menace, by fear of intimidation in some way. So it's a little bit, it encompasses more sexual acts. Contra Costa data, there were about 320 sexual assault police reports made by the 26 law enforcement agencies in Contra Costa County in 2020. I also want to take note that being the survivor of a rape or sexual assault has severe mental health consequences. And the likelihood that somebody suffers suicidal or depressive thoughts increases after a sexual violent act has happened. RAINN, the Rape and Incest National Network, did a study, and they found that about 94% of women who had experienced a rape also have now experienced symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, immediately after the rape took place. And 30% of those women still experience PTSD 9 months after the rape happened. About 33% of women who had been raped had contemplated suicide, and 13% of women who had been raped attempted suicide. So it's one of the things, if somebody comes into our office and they disclose to us that they're a survivor of rape or sexual assault of some kind, we always make sure that we want to get them therapy, group support, whatever they need to ensure that their mental health, they can start getting support for that. Okay, I'm going to do another scenario here. So let me read it out to you and then I'll put up the poll. Ryan and Derek met at a party and started talking. They hit it off immediately and find a quiet corner to make out in. Over the course of the evening, Derek consumes much more alcohol than Ryan does and is slurring his speech and having a hard time standing up. Ryan recognizes that Derek is drunk, but likes that he is being playful and flirtatious. Ryan suggests that they go back to his dorm room. When they get back to Ryan's place, Derek flops on Ryan's bed and closes his eyes. Ryan asks Derek if he can perform oral sex on him, and Derek kind of mumbles something that Ryan can't understand, but seems to cooperate as Ryan begins taking off his pants. So Ryan proceeds to perform oral sex on Derek. So let me launch the next poll again. Okay, do we think this is interpersonal violence? If yes, I'm going to ask you all in the chat, what type of interpersonal violence do you think this is? Got a couple responses coming in here. So far, it's 100% yes. What type of interpersonal violence would you say this was? Yep, sexual assault. Somebody posted. Sexual assault, lack of consent. Yep, there's no consent here. I'm going to share the results here. So yeah, you all are getting this great. This scenario is definitely a sexual assault that took place. There was no consent, right? Because Derek recognized that Ryan was drunk. And if you're incapacitated, you cannot give consent to sexual interaction. Well done, you all. Okay, let me go to the next one here. Okay. I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about stalking. Stalking, according to the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, or SPARC, is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. This definition is always interesting to me because it's not whether or not the person that is on the victim of stalking, whether or not they feel the fear, it's whether a reasonable person would feel fear based on the interactions of another individual. So stalking facts about an estimated 13.5 million people are stalked in a one-year period within the United States. Nearly 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men have experienced stalking victimization within their lifetime. And stalkers use a lot of tactics. Sometimes they approach victims or show up in places where the victim didn't want them to be there or didn't know they were going to be there, making unwanted phone calls, sending unwanted text messages, giving unwanted gifts, or watching or following the victim somehow. Cases that come into our center, stalking is pretty common, and especially with domestic violence relationships, if there is somebody who is trying to leave the relationship or has left the relationship, stalking usually increases. And it comes most in the form, I would say, of phone calls from random phone numbers, text messages from random phone numbers, threats that are constantly made. We have had cases where a client has walked into our center and said, I am positive that a GPS is on my car. I don't know how to figure out how to find that or what to do about reporting it. There's been more than one instance. And I was actually talking with an investigator with the DA's office who handles tech crimes like tracking devices. And he said, tracking devices you can buy on Amazon and they're this big. They can be this big. And so to be able to try and find that in somebody's car, or you could even put that in a purse, it's very easy for somebody to do those things. And especially if they're tech savvy. I mean, even just the Find My Phone app, that's on our phones, right? Whenever we go out and we make a post on Instagram or social media, that automatically tells somebody where we're at. So the first thing we usually tell survivors that come into our office, if we're concerned that they're the victim of stalking, is we tend to have them shut their phone completely off so that we can try and have a conversation without the other person knowing where they are. A little more stalking facts. 2 in 3 of stalkers pursue their victims at least once per week. It's often daily. I've sat within rooms with clients who had, I think somebody sent her 20 text messages in 10 minutes. So it's an abusive pattern of behavior, right? 78% of stalkers use more than one tactic. Weapons are used to harm or threaten victims in 1 in 5 cases. Almost 1 in 3 stalkers have stalked somebody else before. And intimate partner stalkers are the most likely to approach, threaten, or harm their victims somehow. Okay. Grab some water here for a second. Elder abuse, I would say, isn't talked about as much. I would say within the interpersonal violence field, when you're thinking about the types of violence that occur, people usually think of, domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, maybe even human trafficking. People don't always think about elder abuse. But it's a very important category because a lot of times elders that are experiencing abuse, they're experiencing it from their families, from somebody within that intimate relationship. And so somebody commits elder or dependent adult abuse when he or she willfully causes or permits an elder or dependent adult to suffer physically or mentally, commits theft, embezzlement, forgery, fraud, or falsely imprisons an elder. Now, I mentioned that elder abuse, my mother hates when I talk about the definition of what an elder person is because she's over the age of 65 now. So elder abuse at least from the legal perspective, is anybody over the age of 65. So if you're experiencing one of these things, that qualifies as elder abuse. But elder abuse also encompasses dependent adult abuse. And that is anybody between the ages of 18 and 64 that do not have the capacity to care for themselves and rely on somebody else to make decisions for them. This can also include emotional abuse, passive neglect. So again, remember in that definition of domestic violence, neglect wasn't in there, but in child abuse, neglect was in there. It's also in with elder abuse and with dependent adult abuse, because if you're responsible for caring for somebody and you neglect those duties, you don't give them the medication they need, you don't clean them or bathe them, there's a willful deprivation of a necessity of some kind, like food, clothing, that's also considered elder abuse. And this looks very familiar, right? We just did the power control wheel a little bit ago, but this is specifically for elder abuse. And it's interesting because there's some shifts that happened. So I would say about at least a few years ago, at least 40% of the cases that the Family Justice Center saw and then Adult Protective Services saw was financial abuse of an elder individual. And it's usually the adult child who is financially abusing their elder parent. Isolation is also big in elder abuse. You're not letting them see maybe their other children. You're not letting them see their friends. You're isolating them so that you're the sole responsive caretaker, right? And so you have more power and more control over that individual. And also manipulation of family, right? You can, a lot of times we've heard that adult children will tell their other siblings, mom she's starting to lose it. She's starting to get dementia. She really can't make decisions for herself. So I'm going to take over some of those responsibilities, when mom may be perfectly fine and perfectly capable of making those decisions. At least in 2020, there were about 5,300, almost 5,400 elder abuse reports that were made to Adult Protective Services. They have a hotline just like Children and Family Services do. And about 9 out of 10, so 90% of elder abuse cases are abused by a family member. They also tend to suffer more depression, anxiety, and more health-related consequences as well. Okay, so let's do one more scenario. This is the last scenario, I promise. Jean is a 67-year-old female that is showing the beginning signs of dementia. Her 40-year-old adult son lives with her, and he yells at her when he gets frustrated and sometimes forgets to remind her to take her medication. So let me do the poll again one more time. Is this interpersonal violence? And if it is, what type of interpersonal violence is it? I got mostly yeses. A couple of people are saying not sure. A couple of people are saying no. This one's trickier, right? Give people a couple more seconds. Somebody in the chat saying there's neglect involved. Okay. I'm going to end the poll here. So this is interesting. There's a little bit more of a split here, right? About 16 said yes, 4 said no, 9 said not sure. That's okay. This is a harder one to guess on. If Jean, the 67-year-old, came into our office and explained that her 40-year-old son yells at her, forgets to remind her to take her medication, but that's it, I don't know that I would consider this elder abuse. There is neglect here, but because she's only showing the beginning signs of dementia and her son is not responsible for her care yet, I don't know that this would be considered elder abuse. Or if it would just be emotional abuse. This one's really in that gray area, because is her adult son technically responsible for her? is where you get into that, that gray area. So for those of you that said not sure, it could be argued either way. Okay. Some of you on this call are mandated reporters. And so if you ask somebody, have they experienced interpersonal violence? First, tell the client, I am a mandated reporter, and then explain what that means, because you want the client to have the choice of deciding whether or not they want to share their story with you, right? Because it has consequences. It could be reported to Children and Family Services. It could be reported to Adult Protective Services. Sometimes people have a hard time explaining what's happening to them as the victim of some type of interpersonal violence. And so these are some more general ways that you can start those conversations. Things like, has anybody prevented you from getting food, clothes, medication? Do you get upset because somebody talks to you in a way that makes you feel shamed or threatened? Has anyone made you feel afraid or touched you in a way that you didn't want to? Or especially in the elder abuse category, has anyone tried to force you to sign papers or use your money against you? So in looking at survivors, it's really important especially when a client comes into our office, we're listening for risk factors that make them higher risk. So I'm going to use domestic violence as an example. If somebody comes in and tells me their spouse lost their job, that they've been feeling suicidal recently, that they have access to a weapon, that they've been physically abusive in the past, but it's increased since they lost their job. All of these things, my flags are going off, because those are risk factors and increasing the likelihood that somebody could be killed by their partner. So those are things that we really try and listen for when we work with clients, is what risk factors are happening in your situation that increase your likelihood of being severely harmed and or killed by the person doing the harming. And again, as we mentioned, even in the human trafficking scenario for CSEC youth, if they're truant frequently, if there's abuse within their family household and they've been removed by CFS, and now they're living in a foster home, if they have a history of running away to begin with, all of these things are piquing my ears up, and I'm going, okay, this is a more severe case. We need to make sure that we get X, Y, and Z agencies involved. As we listen for risk factors, though, from survivors, we're also listening for protective factors. So protective factors are anything that can help you get out of the situation or help you heal from the situation that has happened. So for example, an individual protective factor is somebody who is very diligent. You know, when clients come in and I see them writing down the information that I'm explaining to them, and I see them going, okay, how best do I contact, this person? How do we want to follow up? That's a protective factor, because right there's organization, there's a demonstration of, I want to make sure I'm getting all the information that I need. There's also family protective factors that we try and work within, see if people are there people within their family and or their community that are going to be able to support them. If you are experiencing domestic violence in your home, can you go to your sister's house? Is that a safe place for you to be? Are you supported there? If there's not that situation of a friend or family member that's capable of supporting somebody, can you rely on somebody within your church or another group that you're involved in? Maybe you're involved in book club and you need the support of somebody within that book club to help you either get out of the situation that you're in or try and heal from that situation as well. So when we talk about risk factors, protective factors, one of the things that anytime a survivor comes into our office, I always try and look at is what are they in need of? And this is just a very broad list. Every survivor is different that comes in. Every survivor is going to need something else because their situation is different and their risk and protective factors are different, right? So somebody who has a sister that supports them and they can move in with them for several months, that's very different from somebody who has no family support. Maybe they don't even have family in the United States and they don't have a place to go. So that need is going to be very different between those two individuals. They need advocacy, they need crisis support, they sometimes can need emergency shelter. Almost everybody needs legal assistance, either in criminal, family, or immigration law, and they need safety. So safety planning is something that we partner with several advocacy agencies on. We work with Domestic Violence Crisis Center with the county. We work with the Rape and Anti-Human Trafficking Crisis Center within the county to try and do what's called safety planning. And so safety planning, this is going to be overwhelming. I'm just showing you now, can look like this. So it's talking with the person about what their situation is right now and breaking down scenarios for them. And so the easiest way to discuss this is to talk about somebody in a domestic violence relationship. We have clients that come in and they're not ready to leave that relationship. And we meet the survivor where they are. And so the first thing that domestic violence crisis advocates that are trained to do is say, okay, you're in this situation right now, you're not ready to leave, but you are experiencing physical violence and you need to make a plan for safety. So if you get in a fight in your home or are physically harmed in your home, you need to think about where you're fighting. Where is that fight taking place? And try and make sure, if you can, position yourself to not be in a kitchen where there's knives or weapons, to try and not be in a bathroom where there's only one exit out of that room. You think about those things. You also think about, can I pack a bag of essential, my passport, my social security card, anything like any important document that you might need? Can I put that in a safe place where the person that's causing me harm is not going to find it and is not going to look for it? These are the conversations that domestic violence crisis advocates have with folks in creating a safety plan. Can you tell somebody what you're experiencing at work? And so if you need to rely on your coworkers, they're already aware of that situation. Is there a safety plan for the kids involved? Let's say you've already filed for a restraining order against your children's parent and you don't want them to be able to pick up the kids at school. You can show the restraining order, give a copy of the restraining order to the school. So the school is now made aware that other parent can no longer pick up those children because there's a court order saying they can't. So it's really brainstorming with the survivor and trying to come up with ways of how can we make sure you are your safest. And a lot of times people usually, if somebody comes to receive support here at the Family Justice Center, and they're not quite ready to leave their relationship, we almost always want them to do safety planning with an advocate before they leave. Because when you're leaving a domestic violence relationship, that is the most critical time. That is the most likely time that somebody's going to get hurt, severely hurt. That's when somebody could be killed. And the reason for that is because in thinking back of that power and control wheel and thinking about that cycle of violence, that person, the victim, is now making a change to that relationship that stops the power and control of the person that's causing harm, right? And so you are interrupting the power and control that person has over you because you were saying, I'm not doing this anymore, I'm leaving. And that's why it makes it the most dangerous time for a survivor to leave or within their domestic violence relationship. When they are leaving, that's when the most severe abuse can happen. And that's when we have seen domestic violence homicides take place. So everybody's here for their own reason. You just wanted to get some information about interpersonal violence. You maybe work with interpersonal violence survivors. You want to be able to spot it easily. What I would say is each one of you interacts with so many more people than our center could ever reach, or a domestic violence crisis center could ever reach. And as we know from the statistics that we've looked at, you're going to, at some point, run into somebody who is being impacted by interpersonal violence. I mean, 1 in 4 women alone experience domestic violence. You're going to run into somebody who's experiencing that. And so one of the things that I really try and hone in this training is to talk about what can you do if somebody comes to you and says, I need help. And that's why I like to talk about the Family Justice Center and why it was created in this county. So I usually always talk about the fact that prior to the Family Justice Center, at least being in Contra Costa County, a survivor would face a system like this. So let's say, for example, there was a domestic violence incident that took place over the weekend, and the police were called out, and the person that caused harm ended up getting arrested. And you have a restraining order, a temporary restraining order, and the police said, go to the courthouse, you need to file for a longer restraining order. So you physically have to drive from wherever you're at to Martinez to get the paperwork, you fill it out, you submit it. Then you don't get it back right away. You have to go back in 24 hours to get that paperwork back. And then you have to go serve that person. So maybe say at the courthouse, the court clerk says, oh, I read through your paperwork, you should really go to a domestic violence organization and get some support. They have great resources. But that domestic violence organization is not in Martinez, it's based in Concord. And so then you have to go to Concord, or you have to call that Concord office to make an appointment. And you see where I'm going with this, right? That there are all these resources that might be available. But if we think about somebody who's experiencing trauma, going back to what I was talking about at the very beginning, and you have just experienced a traumatic event, you are still in that fight or flight mode. You are not thinking clearly, you're not able to organize things in your brain. And so all of a sudden you may have 5 or 10 resources that are great resources, but that you were responsible for finding and seeking out. Now, couple that with, what if you don't have a car? If you don't have a car, you can't get anywhere in Contra Costa County. I know BART is great, you can get into the city, but beyond that, what if you need to get from Antioch to Richmond? That takes forever without a car. What if you have young children? So now you have to take your young children with you to the courthouse, to the domestic violence advocacy organization, to wherever else. And what if English is not your first language? And so this process takes even longer and longer. And so what ends up happening is the survivors given all of these resources that they never utilize, because they're not in a headspace. They're not in a situation where they can do it. And that is the reason why the Family Justice Center was created. It was created so that this model would happen. Instead of the survivor being responsible for going to all of these different organizations, you have the survivor going to one spot. And so the Family Justice Center has 3 locations. We have this one in Concord, we have one in Richmond, one in Antioch. And the whole point is to have as many partner agencies as possible at our centers. We have a bunch of cubicles. We have a whole bunch of partners that come in, set up, do their work out of our office, so that if survivor walks in, they can get these services. They can meet with an attorney. They can talk to a domestic violence crisis advocate about safety planning. They can sign up for public benefits if that's something that they're needing. All of a sudden, the responsibility no longer is on the survivor to try and connect with all of these agencies. They're just there for you. And one of the other things that the Family Justice Center really tries to do is stay connected to survivors on the long-term scale. So while I would say most of our clients come in because something has just happened, our clients are not always in that space, like 3 months down the road, 6 months down the road. Maybe they have left their relationship and they're doing better, but they're still needing support. And so what we believe that clients need in order to have long-term safety. You have to have community support. You have to have some type of wealth. Doesn't have to be millions, but you have to have something coming in. You have to have education and training, and you have to have your health. And if you have those 4 factors in place, the long-term safety is extended. So what we try and do here, as I mentioned before, we have about 20 staff. We have 2 to 3 navigators at each of our centers. 10 out of 19 of those speak Spanish. Excuse me, it should be 10 out of 20 of those speak Spanish. We have 66 partner agencies that are on site between our 3 centers that survivors can get connected to. And the most important thing is we have what are called navigators. So we don't call the folks that meet with our clients advocates, because that's a very legal term, because that requires specific training, a 40-hour training. It's a certification that you do. Our navigators, that's not what we're asking them to do. What we ask our navigators to do is become resource experts, so that when somebody comes into our agency and they talk with the navigator, they can say X, Y, and Z is happening to me. And the navigator can go through all of the resources that they're aware of and all of the partner agencies that we have on site. And they can say, let's get you connected to these people. And the partners are the experts, right? The partners are the one that have all of those other resources, but it's very much like a GPS system. It's the survivor doesn't know where they need to go to get help, but they know they need help. Like, say, for example, you don't know how to drive to Tahoe, but you need to get to Tahoe for your family vacation or whatever. The navigator is the navigation piece for the survivor. And we stick with our survivors on the long-term basis. So we connect them to as many programs as we can that cover those 4 areas that I was talking about a minute ago. So we offer yoga classes. We offer parenting classes in partnership with COPE. We offer once a month community circles, folks to have that community. And so all of a sudden, you're building on that long-term safety mechanism so that you can stay safe in the long term. A lot of people have been asking recently, how is COVID impact the services at your center? What are you seeing more? COVID had a significant impact on our clients. It had a significant impact on everybody. We made the decision after the shelter-in-place orders went into effect in March of 2020 to remain open. And the reason for that is because we're a drop-in center. And when you're asking people to stay at home and shelter in place, if you're experiencing domestic violence in your home, home is not a safe place for you to be. You cannot call our center and have a safe conversation. And so we wanted to make sure there was a place still available for folks to come if they needed that support. Between 2020 and 2021, we saw an 18% increase in the number of clients that we supported. And as I mentioned before, many of those clients remained in those abusive relationships because of the financial impact that COVID had on them. They could not afford to leave. And we know housing, there's no housing during the pandemic. I mean, there's still no housing, but there's no housing that was available during the pandemic. You can't walk through places. You can't go meet with landlords. So trying to find housing for survivors who are experiencing very severe abuse became a lot more difficult. Even the shelters that were in Contra Costa County shut down for a while. And so we were working with some of our partners to make sure that there was a motel option for folks. So it had a really big impact. I would say the things that we saw the most need from our clients were legal assistance, especially in filing restraining orders, mental health counseling. They needed therapy. They wanted to talk to somebody because COVID, on top of everything else that they were experiencing, just became completely overwhelming to folks. And they needed childcare. You know, when things started to open up and people went back to work, kids still weren't going back to school. And so all of a sudden there was such a need for childcare that maybe you just got back from your minimum wage job. It had been closed because it was a restaurant of some kind or something like that. And now all of a sudden your kids are at home all the time. You're making minimum wage. And how in the world are you going to try and pay for childcare for your children? And as I mentioned before, we also saw housing as a really big need within our community. We're still seeing that, unfortunately. The shelters have opened up more, thank goodness. We work with partners that are still moteling survivors if they need to leave their situations. Okay, so I'm running a little bit early, but we're coming to the end of the training. I always try and make a call to action for you all. So I'm going to tell you, you have a little bit of homework. My ask is that from this training today, you tell 3 friends either about Family Justice Center services or about something that you learned from this training. And if that's something you don't feel like doing, you're not comfortable talking about that, whatever, go check out our website and see what we have available for survivors. Because again, what I mentioned was in your lifetime, whether it's through your work or your personal life, you will run into somebody who is dealing with interpersonal violence that may need support. And you want to make sure you are aware of the resources in your area. So even if you're not within Contra Costa County, we saw some people from Sonoma and Marin on this training, that you're aware of the resources available in your county so that when you have that person come to you for support, you know the resources you can direct them to get help. That being said, if you are in Contra Costa County and you do have time, we would love for you to come visit our centers. They are completely open. You're welcome to drop in. You don't need to call and make an appointment ahead of time. And also, if you do have somebody that is needing support, they need to be connected to a navigator, feel free to call any one of our offices and say, hey, I did the IPV 101 training. I wanted to run a case by you or a situation and my friend is in, and I talked to somebody for a minute. You can absolutely do that. I have those conversations all the time. In fact, I want to share, I'm going to share my email just in case you need to get a hold of me for any reason. But I also want to share with you that there was a therapist that works through the county with Contra Costa, and she took one of our trainings on human trafficking. It's called Human Trafficking 101. And she was not familiar with human trafficking indicators. She wasn't familiar with working with human trafficking survivors. That's not her line of work. And she took that before COVID when our trainings were in person. When she took that, she made a note of the things. But she made a note of the things of what was happening for human trafficking survivors, what to be on the lookout for. And during COVID, she reached out to me and she said, I met with a client today, a patient today, and I think she's a human trafficking survivor because she's meeting a lot of the things that I remember from your training. And so she got connected, the survivor got connected to us. We were able to support her, and she was in fact a human trafficking survivor. So from that training, she took those little nuggets of information, and when that situation presented herself, she then knew how to handle it. So just to keep that in mind, because you never know who you're going to run into that's going to need support, that's going to need your help. So let me stop sharing my screen because I know we have some questions coming up. Somebody mentioned that the URL isn't working for me. I'll double check our website when we get off of this training and make sure that it's up and running because it should be working. Other questions, feel free to unmute. Other questions folks have about IPV 101, about the services of the Family Justice Center, please feel free to go ahead and ask. No questions? All right. I want to thank you all for joining us in this training today. I really appreciate your time listening to us. Listening to me present on this topic. It's a very important topic close to my heart that I care a lot about. We are going to be sending an evaluation out to you after this training. I look at those. I actually do spend time and read them. I would greatly appreciate it if you could take a couple minutes to rate our training and let us know what we did, what I did well and what I did not do well. Because I utilize those comments in the next trainings that I do. So I really, really appreciate and value your comments. But I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Have a great weekend. It's Friday. We're almost there, folks. So I hope you have a great day. And thanks so much for being here with us. Bye, everybody. Yes, and the PowerPoint, when you get the evaluation information, the PowerPoint will also be sent as well.
Thank you very much, Natalie.
Thanks, Katie.
Bye. Thank you so much.